Right now, somewhere in your house, there's a tap. You turn it. Clean water comes out. You don't think about where it came from or whether it's safe. You just drink. 60,000 years ago, that decision could kill you. There was no tap, no filter, no guarantee. A wrong choice, the wrong pool, the wrong water could mean disease or death for you and everyone you loved. So your ancestors learned to read landscapes the way you read a label. They knew which water moved and which sat still, which bubbled up clean from underground, filtered by sand and stone, and which bred sickness in silence. We're talking about a stretch of time so vast it's hard to hold in your mind. From roughly 1.6 million years ago, when early hominins first began sharing food and protecting the vulnerable, to about 3,500 years ago, when the last hunter-gatherers were settling into farming life. Across that span, through ice ages, through migrations across every continent, through encounters with other human species like the Neanderthals, populations who could never have met each other kept arriving at the same conclusions about what mattered. So the question is, if wealth, status, and hierarchy feel so natural to us today, were they actually there from the beginning? Or did we invent something our ancestors would barely recognize? Before your ancestors valued almost anything else, they valued the ability to make fire happen on command, not wait for it. At Barnum, in Suffolk, England, around 400,000 years ago, early Neanderthals struck a rare lump of iron pyrite against flint. Sparks jumped. This wasn't luck, it was a plan, requiring a rare mineral sourced on purpose just to make fire whenever it was needed, instead of whenever nature allowed it. That shift changed everything downstream. Fire meant a thermal barrier against brutal winters. It meant safety from predators who instinctively avoided flame. It became the ancestor of every kitchen table and campfire conversation you've ever had. But here's what's fascinating. Fire didn't just keep people warm, it rewired their bodies. At Daughters of Jacob Ridge in Israel, dated to roughly 780,000 years ago, early humans were already heat-treating food. Deliberate cooking. Cooking neutralizes pathogens, breaks down toxins, and tenderizes food so the body spends less energy digesting it. That saved energy over hundreds of thousands of years, helped fuel the evolutionary enlargement of the human brain. Your brain, the one generating the thought you're having right now, exists partly because your ancestors valued cooked food over raw, but controlling fire only solved the problem of surviving tonight. What happened when the strongest hunter in the group got hurt? Ancient humans didn't just tolerate the sick and disabled, they built survival systems around keeping them alive. In the Zagros Mountains of Iraq, between 45,000 and 70,000 years ago, a Neanderthal man, archaeologists call him Shanadarwan, was blind, missing an arm, his legs deformed. By any measure of raw utility, he was a liability. He lived to an advanced age anyway. Someone brought him food every day, for years. This is part of a pattern stretching across the entire human story. At Kubifora, Kenya, 1.6 million years ago, a Homo ergaster woman with a severe bone disease was protected through weeks of incapacitation. At the Windover site in Florida, 7,000 years ago, a teenage boy with paralyzing spina bifida, who could never have hunted or gathered, was kept clean, nourished, and cared for until 15 or 17 years old. His broken bone carefully splinted and healed. So why would groups with barely enough food for themselves spend so much of it on people who could never pay it back? Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy has an answer: the cooperative breeding hypothesis. Human infants mature slowly, need enormous energy, and arrive close together. No single mother could carry that alone. So humans relied on alloparents, grandmothers, fathers, siblings, unrelated group members, all helping raise the young. Infants best at reading multiple caregivers' faces and intentions survived more often. Generation after generation, that selected for something we now think of as deeply human: empathy. That's not a modern virtue. That's a 1.6 million year old survival strategy still running in your brain every time you feel the pull to help a stranger. But keeping people alive was step one. What happened when the skills a group depended on were too complex to just watch and copy? In a Natufian settlement in Israel, roughly 15,000 years ago, a child's fingers pressed into unfired clay beside an adult's shaping a bead together. 15,000 years later, archaeologists found both sets of fingerprints, frozen side by side. This mattered because survival knowledge was never simple. Making a Clovis point in North America required precise stone reduction and a delicate technique called called overshot flaking, not something you learn by watching once. In Australia, entire landscapes of survival knowledge waterholes, migration routes, terrain were encoded into songlines, oral maps passed down through generations. Here's what almost nobody talks about. None of it was written down. If the chain of teaching broke, that knowledge could vanish from human memory forever. Every successful handoff, flint napping, water finding, songlines is an unbroken chain reaching back to you. But knowledge could only spread as far as trust would allow. And trust wasn't as automatic as we like to imagine. Ancient cooperation wasn't an effortless instinct, it was actively enforced. Among hunter-gatherers like the Hadza of Tanzania, sharing surplus meat was insurance. The hunter who shared today could rely on being fed tomorrow since hunting success was unpredictable. But equality didn't happen naturally. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm documented reverse dominance. If a skilled hunter began acting superior, the group cut him back down with humor, ridicule, and criticism before his status could turn into power. Modern experiments with the Hadza show sharing was often driven by direct, persistent demand from campmates, not pure inner fairness. Equality, in other words, was a system your ancestors had to keep choosing, keep defending. Cooperation was hard work, and if it had to be defended so carefully, what did people actually get out of playing along? Status had almost nothing to do with what you owned, and everything to do with what you contributed: skill at hunting, tool-making, generosity, ecological memory. That respect brought real influence, alliances, and better prospects. But the moment prestige curdled into coercion, the same social pressure that maintained equality pushed back. Status stayed fluid, merit-based, never permanent. And yet ancient humans weren't minimalists by accident. The Clovis culture of North America carried translucent chalcedony, colorful jasper, and fine chert, not local stone, sometimes over 900 kilometers, purely for quality and beauty. Tens of thousands of years before money or writing, humans were already making art, and it wasn't luxury, it was identity. At Uchazla Cave in Turkey and Sar Akil in Lebanon, 41,000 to 43,000 years ago, humans mass-produced pierced marine shell beads that did nothing to help anyone survive a winter, but communicated instantly who you were and where you belonged. At almost the same time, in Germany's Swabian Alb, humans carved flutes from swan bone and mammoth ivory. In Australia, an unbroken tradition of red ochre use stretches back at least 65,000 years, used in ceremony, initiation, and sacred rock art. None of this was frivolous. In a world without written contracts, a shell bead or a streak of ochre was how humans signaled belonging across vast distances, to people who might not share a single word of language. And these values didn't just repeat locally, they traveled. Trace element analysis has followed obsidian found in Texas back to sources in Idaho and Mexico, over 1,000 kilometers away in either direction. In Australia, sacred ochre moved hundreds of kilometers along dreaming trade routes. None of these networks existed to build wealth. They existed to build relationships, which brings us to something worth reframing. Hierarchy, wealth, centralized power. We tend to assume these are just human nature. They're not. Across most of the deep human record, centralized power and private land ownership were absent, sometimes actively resisted. Order was kept through shared norms and consensus. Individual autonomy wasn't a modern ideal, it was, for most of our history, a sacred right. Some of the most powerful evidence hides in the smallest details. At El Sidrón Cave in Spain, researchers analyzed the hardened plaque on a Neanderthal's teeth, a man suffering a dental abscess and a parasite. Buried in that plaque, traces of poplar wood, which contains the same active compound as modern aspirin, and traces of a natural antibiotic mold. This wasn't accidental diet. This was targeted self-treatment, tens of thousands of years before pharmacology existed. At Windover in Florida, archaeologists recovered 87 fragments of hand-woven textiles, preserved 8,000 years in wet peat genuine skill, hours of dedicated labor. And among those Natufian clay beads in Israel, several were shaped to mimic wild barley and wheat, thousands of years before agriculture existed. Not everything here is settled. In Slovenia, a 50,000-year-old cave bear bone with 4 aligned holes may be the world's oldest flute, or it may just be hyena bite marks. The debate is unresolved, whether human equality reflects genuine inborn fairness, or whether it only survives because societies built aggressive mechanisms to force selfish people into line, is still argued today. Even Neanderthal care for the injured, was it compassion or calculated cost-benefit, remains an open question. These debates don't weaken the story. They show real science refusing an easy answer. So what did we gain moving from that world to this one? Abundance beyond anything a Pleistocene forager could imagine: water at the turn of a handle, food without a hunt, medicine descended strangely from a Neanderthal chewing poplar bark for pain relief. But something was left behind: the tight daily accountability of a small band, the forced uncomfortable equality that ridicule once maintained, the intimacy of a fingerprint pressed beside a child's in wet clay, passing on knowledge with no backup copy. Your body still carries the evidence. The pull of empathy you feel watching someone struggle, that's Kubifora, that's Shanidar, still running in your nervous system. The craving for music, for the one object that feels like it carries a piece of who you are, that's Geis and Klosterla, still speaking through you. We didn't invent meaning. We inherited it from people who had almost nothing by modern standards and still found something worth carrying 900 kilometers, worth teaching a child's hands to shape, worth staying up all night to protect. The tap in your kitchen is new. What's reaching for connection, for fairness, for someone to notice when you're hurting? That part was already old, long before any of this began.